Huh, okay.
I picked up a Mac Classic from Free Geek Twin Cities to check out and refurbish. Based on the note, it looks like it had gotten a cursory look, but as many who are into vintage technology already know, there's often more problems lurking beneath the surface. I went to take it apart for a peek inside, and something I found right off the bat is that a screw standoff at the top had broken off. Thankfully, it's not a critical part and didn't cause any damage to the front of the case. I used a pair of pliers to hold it while I removed the stuck screw. A welcome surprise was the presence of a RAM daughter card. These were optional but necessary if you wanted to upgrade the Classic's memory. We'll get into why a bit later. I wanted to get a look at the motherboard, so I proceeded to disconnect the hard drive's SCSI cable as well as the ribbon from the floppy drive. Sliding the board up from the chassis gave me better access to the wiring harness connector, then I could remove it completely. My main concern was if the clock or PRAM battery had leaked. When this happens, the electrolyte will seriously damage nearby traces and components, sometimes beyond repair. Thankfully, this one hadn't, and other than some dust and dirt from use and storage, the motherboard looked okay. But I still didn't waste any time pulling the battery out, especially since it was the one this Mac had shipped with. I like to soak boards in isopropyl alcohol to loosen the dirt and better reveal any problems, so I know what I'm getting myself into. Another common issue with vintage computers is, of course, failing electrolytic capacitors, and trying to replace them on a clean motherboard is a much better experience than on a dirty one. After scrubbing with an old toothbrush, I left the board to sit for an hour or so, and there was no need to do the same to that RAM card since it only has a single tantalum cap, which is impervious to leaking. While the board soaked, I figured I could do some other repairs or maintenance. The original hard drive was still present, so I got it removed from the chassis. The label claims it's a 40 megabyte unit, and while the note on the machine said it still works, I'd need to look closer at it later on. Next to come out was the floppy drive, which is secured by 4 screws through the bottom of the chassis. One of them is behind this plastic fan shroud, but Apple's engineers cleverly included a hole to access it. These drives are generally pretty reliable, but there's a few maintenance tasks to perform due to their age. The big one has to deal with the loading and eject mechanism. Old grease can cause it to bind up, and while this one still worked, it wasn't as smooth as it should be. I removed the eject motor assembly to get it out of the way, then turned to the drive sled. At first glance, it looks a bit daunting to take apart, but it's actually deceptively easy. Just a plastic clip and a couple of springs to come off, then drop the sled down as if a disc had been inserted, and it lifts right out. 4 flexible washers hold the bottom slider to the rest of the drive, and they easily unclip. You can see the spots where the 2 parts rub against each other. It's metal on metal, so lubrication in these locations is absolutely necessary. A swab with some white lithium grease is my go-to for these, and it doesn't take much. I applied some more to the bottom of the slider, then got it put back together. I found that those washers snap back into place pretty easily with the help of a small socket. Another problem related to the disk mechanism is the eject motor itself. Inside it are several plastic gears, and one of them is softer than the others as it was meant to be sacrificial in case a disk got stuck. But over time, this means it's become more brittle, and when it breaks, the drive won't eject. This one still looks okay, so I'll roll with it for now, but if it fails, there are modern reproductions available. Just a couple other quick bits of drive maintenance. I cleaned the heads with a swab soaked in alcohol, then I dabbed some fresh grease on the head carriage screw. If this doesn't move smoothly, then the drive can have trouble reading disks. After that, I was able to get both hard and floppy drives reinstalled in the chassis and check on the motherboard. It cleaned up nicely, so I could go ahead with replacing the caps. I like protecting plastic parts like this connector with foil and capped on tape, since my preference for removing old caps is to use hot air. There are other methods too, but I've found this way to present the least risk of damaging solder pads, even if it comes at the risk of a cap occasionally exploding in the process. But with some patience, I got all 10 electrolytic caps removed without incident. I went over the solder pads with some fresh solder and braid to clean them up, then got the new caps installed. I went with electrolytics again since that's what I had on hand, but I've slowly been switching over to tantalum caps as the opportunity allows. With that done, it was time to test the machine out. I got everything reconnected, then plugged in my external blue SCSI. I flipped the switch and the machine sprang to life. And I held down Shift-Command-Option-Delete to tell it to skip trying to boot from the hard drive and use the blue SCSI instead. The Classic got halfway through startup, then threw an error about not having enough memory. I could have tried starting up without extensions enabled, but decided to use an old party trick instead. In a nod to the machine's development codename, holding down Command-Option-XO at power-up will tell it to skip any drives attached to the system and boot from ROM instead. To explain this, a brief history of the Mac Classic is in order. It debuted in 1990 as the lowest-priced machine in Apple's lineup in an effort to drive sales and adoption of the platform. While other Macs at the time were using Motorola 68020 or 030 CPUs, in an effort to save costs, the Classic stuck with an 8 MHz 68000, the same as what shipped in the very original Macintosh from 1984. Another way to save production costs was through simplifying its motherboard, which was literally half the size of other compact Macs and used fewer components. And that included its ROM. Apple's engineers had managed to shrink the ROM code down enough to fit into a single chip with space left over. That empty space would have otherwise gone to waste, so a minimal version of System 6 was included as well. It wasn't the kind of thing you were expected to use regularly, and most Classic owners didn't even know it existed. But for troubleshooting like this, it's proven awfully convenient. And yeah, here's why I couldn't boot from the blue SCSI. This machine only has 2 MB of RAM, something we'll address in a moment. But first, I wanted to test the hard drive. While it was already blank, formatting it again would be a good way to check for errors as the process scans the entire surface of the disk. The format was successful and didn't take terribly long, mostly because the drive was indeed the 40 MB model that the label on the bracket indicated. It's unlikely then that this machine ever saw an upgrade. I wanted to change that. A configuration of 2 MB of RAM and a 40 meg hard disk was a common one for the Classic, though it wasn't the only option. To cut costs, Apple had included just 1 MB of RAM on the machine's motherboard, with an additional 1 meg on that expansion card. But it also came with two 30-pin SIMs that could hold another 2 MB, for a maximum of 4 megs in the system. That was a pretty low ceiling for the era, but considering the Classic was intended for basic tasks, it wasn't too much of a problem. With the added memory being recognized successfully, I noticed another problem that had been referenced by the note on the machine. The display image seemed to be wobbling. I'd never seen this specific issue before, but it was likely due to a problem with the Mac's analog board. Before I dug into that, I paused to install a more appropriate OS on the built-in hard drive, System 7. It brought big improvements over System 6, but still performed decently on lower-end hardware like this one, even if the slowness of the installation process suggested otherwise. Oh, and what about the floppy drive? Might as well give it a quick test. Yup, reading the disk just fine, and ejecting without issue too. Nice. I took a cursory look at the analog board and didn't see anything obviously wrong. It has a number of capacitors on it, but none of them were bulging or leaking. That doesn't mean much though, so a closer inspection was in order, and that involves removing the board from the chassis. I have no plans to actually use this footage because showing it in a video would be just as detrimental as like showing how I apply thermal paste, and honestly probably even worse. But you know, in case it makes a big boom or something, at least we've got, you know, evidence that it happened. You can see my demise, I suppose. I discharged the CRT and got all the cables and wiring harnesses disconnected. Then just a pair of screws needed to come out, and I could lean the board over far enough to unplug the fan. There were a few revisions of analog boards in the Mac Classic, and this is one of the earlier ones. And despite Apple's corner cutting, it used good quality parts, like these 105-degree rated Nichicon capacitors. I did spot something iffy in this film cap leaning against a resistor. The legs weren't quite making contact, but they were awfully close, so I bent it out of the way. But resistors are actually the likely cause of that display wobble, not the caps. While researching the problem, I found that the tolerance on the power supply's feedback resistors can drift with age, causing the voltage to go out of spec. To test this, I reassembled the machine and probed a couple pins on the motherboard's floppy drive port. The 12-volt rail was only showing 10.6, and the 5-volt rail was down to 4.4. And that's enough to cause video problems like I was seeing. There's a single potentiometer on the analog board that adjusts the voltage rails, and it just needed a little tweak. But it's tricky to reach with the board installed, and often involves some trial and error. I used electrical tape to cobble together a long insulated screwdriver, and with the machine turned off and unplugged, I carefully turned the pot a small amount. Eventually, I was able to get the voltages much closer to where they should be. Yes, capacitors are often the cause of problems, but not always. It's best to research symptoms first, instead of just throwing parts at them. With the machine fully reassembled, I was able to take on the last task, cleaning it up. Apparently, the batch of computers it was from had been donated by the family of a longtime collector, as evidenced by this price sticker. It's been a long time since computers we'd consider vintage sold for $7 on sale. I used some Goo Gone to deal with the sticker residue, then some all-purpose cleaner for the rest of the dirt and grime on the case. This machine isn't in perfect shape, but it came out looking pretty good, especially after I gently used a magic eraser to take care of the scuffs. It'll go back to Free Geek Twin Cities to be sold in its thrift store. Mac Classics aren't terribly sought after by collectors these days due to their low performance and lack of expandability. But when new, they were a hot seller, approaching 40,000 in October 1990 when the model launched, and almost 250,000 in just the first 3 months of 1991. Price was a major factor in this, and that cost-cutting on Apple's part meant a base model Classic with 1 mega RAM and no hard drive sold for under $1,000 US, which was quite compelling. The config with 2 megs of RAM and a 40 meg hard drive, like the machine we just worked on, sold for $1,500. This did exactly what Apple hoped, to expand the Mac's market share. The Classic was the entry-level model, while the LC and IIsi brought better performance, options for upgrades, and color displays. By late 1991, Apple addressed the Classic's low performance with a new version, the Classic 2, which came with a 16 MHz 68030 processor and a maximum RAM limit of 10 megabytes. But the original Classic stuck around for another year as a low-cost option for schools. While the evolution of computing has generally revolved around increasingly better specifications, reductions in manufacturing costs have been just as important, especially in the early 90s as personal computing was really taking off. Just like now, not everyone needed the latest and greatest to get basic tasks done, and having an affordable computer with older parts in it was far better than not having a computer at all. The Mac Classic wasn't the sort of thing that got much attention for its technology, but to the mainstream market, its value made it a runaway success. If you liked the video, I'd appreciate a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. Please consider supporting my work on Patreon, and as always, thanks for watching.